Management of the economy is very important. Today we'll talk to someone who is managing one of the largest economies in the English-speaking Caribbean, the Finance Minister of Jamaica, the Honorable Omar Davies. So don't go anywhere. CaribNation is up next. Hnds, today we're going to talk about the economy, and I have with me in the studio none other than the Finance Minister of Jamaica, Honorable Omar Davies. Minister Davies, welcome to CaribNation.
Well, thank you very much.
I suppose being Minister of Finance these days is not such an easy job.
Well, I just suspect it's never been an easy job. Yeah, but you just have to. There are the tasks and the challenges. One thing you can be certain, it's not a boring job.
I can imagine so.
Yeah.
I said at the beginning of the program that we are in this era of globalization, what I call most of the time the second wave of globalization, because the Caribbean has always had to deal with globalization from the time of slavery and colonialism and so forth. And as you try to exact so economic survival for Jamaica, you obviously must deal with this reality of globalization. How is it that you're able to deal with globalization and satisfy some of the basic economic requirements in your country?
Well, some sectors of the economy have always been in global competition. For example, bauxite alumina. That's not an industry for which there's domestic demand. So that industry has always had to take global costs into consideration and global competition into consideration. Similarly with tourism, perhaps the most globally competitive of all industries, because people can always choose which country they're going to visit. The problem relates to sectors which have had some measure of protection, either domestically or through those export sectors which have had special quotas assigned to them. The problem therefore has been to force those sectors into accepting that the era of protection is over, or if not over, is disappearing. And that's where the major problem has been. And I'm speaking about the traditional exports like sugar and bananas, or the domestic manufacturing sector, or the sector producing for domestic consumption. Those are the sectors we have had to impress on them the reality of that competition. We have utilized various techniques, but perhaps the most important is to bring down costs in terms of reducing inflation, because inflation, by inflating revenues, can give you an opportunity to hide your inefficiencies, and that's one of the things that we have focused on, is to bring inflation down, and inflation used to be a significant problem in Jamaica.
How successful have you been?
Well, not me, but the administration. We have been very successful. I mean, we haven't reached. I wouldn't declare victory yet. But in 1991-92, for example, I'm speaking about the fiscal year, inflation in Jamaica actually went over 100%. Over the last 4 fiscal years, we have had single-digit inflation, and it's been the first time in probably 30 or 40 years that we have had 4 consecutive years of single-digit inflation. So both numerically as well as in terms of state of mind, we have made a significant step forward in that regard.
Make the link between a reduction of inflation and the actual living standard of the ordinary people in Jamaica.
Well, that's a very good question, because it's something which I've tried to impress on the trade unions, that of all price increases, of all taxes, inflation is the most cruel, because the poor cannot defend themselves against it. If you look at professionals can move their fees up. If you look at persons involved in trade, they can always adjust and say, well, the prices have gone up. But someone who is say in a particular job with a union contract cannot defend himself or herself against those increases. So, or someone who doesn't have a fixed job but has a marginal job if he or she attempts to increase their revenues in line with inflation, then they could lose their job. So in a strange way, although the poor do not see it in terms of a tangible fighting inflation, certainly our fight against inflation is geared towards assisting the poor. And we do an annual survey to assess a poverty line and to assess persons who fall below the poverty line, because we target programs along those lines. And the controlling inflation has had the most positive impact on reducing the number of persons who fall below the poverty line. It's a direct link. If you look at purchasing power, if you look at what $100, if you have $100 this year and there's 20% inflation, it requires $120 to buy the same amount of goods and services as it did last year. If you reduce that inflation to 5 or 8, then it means that you're ahead of the game in terms of compared to 20%. So for the poor, in fight against inflation is perhaps the most important positive step you can take.
As far as working people, poor people are concerned, the generation of jobs, employment is extremely important. It is the vehicle through which they see themselves earning their bread, earning their keep. How successful have you been in generating new employment?
That has, if you ask, perhaps has been our weakest area, because your first question was regard to how do you adjust to globalization, and in several instances, adjustment to globalization has meant reducing the number of persons. One of the companies which has been most successful in terms of adjusting is Grace Kennedy, and they have significantly increased their output and their revenues, but at the same time they have trimmed their overall workforce. Similarly, the bauxite alumina companies have had to, when they looked at their labor costs, they've had to trim their labor costs to remain competitive. I think that has been our major fallout. The economy, therefore, has to start growing in new sectors, and one of the things we have been trying to do is to identify those sectors which can grow. And we have identified tourism as, because of several particular advantages. I know this is CaribNation, but I would say without fear of contradiction that if you look at the Jamaican tourism product, it's perhaps it's the best in the Caribbean. You can, if you want mountains, the mountains of Dominica and St. Lucia are your only competitors. If you want beaches, if you want whatever you want in music, it's the best combination. So we've been pushing for continued growth in tourism. We have also, in the last year or so, identified the information technology sector, and we have made some significant strides. So those are the sectors which we are emphasizing. It doesn't mean we're abandoning the old sectors, because we feel that they can retool and be competitive. But in terms of expansion of the economy, we're concentrating on the IT sector, information technology sector, and on tourism.
Let's continue to talk about this whole question of the poor and the dispossessed in society within this whole mix. Structural adjustment obviously means structurally adjusting the working people on a constant basis. What mechanisms have you put in place to kind of cushion the impact of structural adjustment on the poor?
Actually, again, an excellent question, and I should indicate that I'm not just Minister of Finance, but I'm Minister of Finance and Planning.
Okay.
So that's actually right up my responsibility. What we have done, and we have been far advanced in this, not just in the Caribbean, but in the world, in terms of annually studying the situation of the poor and targeting the programs precisely because of the negative effects of structural adjustment. And what we have done, we have our food stamp program, and that's for the indigent and mothers who are not working, mothers with young children not working. We also have various support programs in terms of drugs for the elderly, so they can access whatever pharmaceuticals they need. But we've introduced another thing called a social investment fund. And this fund allows for grant funding for communities to assist with social infrastructure, fixing drains, fixing schools, fixing whatever the community identifies as being necessary to assist to improve their standard of living. So it's both social infrastructure as well as physical infrastructure. So there is a whole series of programs which we have coordinated. We also have what was introduced last year called the Lift Up Jamaica program, which simultaneously aims to create employment for the semi-skilled persons, young semi-skilled persons, but at the same time to respond to critical needs within communities, particularly inner city communities. So we have, despite the problems in the budget, we have identified a set of programs which are funded in the social sector and in the for physical infrastructure aimed at improving the lives of the poor. But in the long run, the only answer to poverty is increased training and education. That is the only answer to poverty. I mean, you can't subsidize the poor ad infinitum just by providing them with money. The long run is that you must provide the poor, and the children of the poor, with opportunities to move themselves up from poverty through education and training.
And the logical question from that is, what are some of the programs that you have in place to deal with this whole question of training and preparation for some of the jobs and the economic opportunities that will come their way? That is making them employable.
Employable. Well, two ways. We have the formal education system, which is, primary school, secondary school, and we're expanding the base of secondary school. And we're rapidly trying to expand tertiary education, not just in the University of the West Indies, but we also have the University of Technology, which is government-run. It used to be the College of Arts, Science, and Technology, but it has been elevated to university. We're increasing the use of the training colleges and broadening their range of offerings. And there's a private university run by the Seventh-day Adventists called Northern Caribbean University. So we're expanding the range of opportunities through tertiary institutions. We're trying to increase the use of these campuses outside of Kingston to teach tertiary subjects, and such that you don't have to come to Kingston to University of Technology or University of the West Indies. But we have a specialized technical training institution called HEART, which then focuses on vocational training and a certification program, formerly like your masons or carpenters sort of were apprenticed and learned the trade, but we are now going through a modular system of certification, such that students who have a grade 9 formal education can then apply to HEART and then become certified in a variety of ways. HEART is involved in the training of IT personnel. And so what we're trying to do is to systematically broaden the range of opportunities for persons, and it doesn't matter whether you missed out on your first turn in terms of the formal educational system. There are opportunities for you to, in whatever position you have, and to upgrade yourself. So even if you lose your job, you could retool or be retrained for new opportunities. But our objective is that every young person will have had the opportunity to go through primary, secondary, and to obtain some skill, not necessarily go on into academic tertiary, but to obtain some skill through the HEART training institutions.
Some people have said that the Caribbean governments have surrendered to the dictates of neoliberalism administered by the World Bank and the IMF and the large doses of structural adjustment. Is that a fair criticism?
Well, I don't know where, it is a fact that the multilaterals have had a significant impact, and I suspect, I don't know how many PhD dissertations have been written about Jamaica's struggle with the IMF. So I don't know if they will, when they say Caribbean governments, Jamaica has carried the fight in terms of certain principles. And there are things which we have frankly said no to. I'm not saying that we have been the reason for the changes, but for example, the IMF World Bank once held is almost a doctrine that devaluation was the answer to your problems of being competitive. And we took a decision not to. And we stopped borrowing from the IMF, partly because we felt that we couldn't agree. Subsequently, other countries have taken positions, and I don't want it to seem as a stand, but we could say that there have been significant changes in some of the policy positions. And I would like to believe that the position we took and articulated would have had some influence on that. On the other hand, I don't want it to seem matron, because on the other hand, we have had to adjust. There are things which we have accepted. For example, controls on foreign exchange. Jamaica has totally liberalized its foreign exchange system. And we did it not because of dictate from the IMF or the World Bank, but the reality is that the society had liberated it. Virtually everybody was keeping some foreign exchange. Now, we have discovered that by liberating it totally, and we have totally liberalized the system, it hasn't made any difference. People, the ordinary persons in Jamaica are allowed to keep foreign exchange accounts. And in fact, they have more reserves, which they keep freely in Jamaica, than the central bank itself. So there has been a learning process, but I would not believe that the evidence is there that we have not surrendered. More generally, I believe that the Caribbean has demonstrated a willingness to take positions which are perhaps, one would think that a group of small countries wouldn't have that courage. And we have taken positions as a region which would be out of line with our size or economic power.
Talking about the Caribbean and the region, let's move now to regional economics and talk about the single market and economy, which has been on stream now for a couple of years. And where is that? Where is Jamaica in the mix of things? Is there optimism?
Well, we have always accepted the inevitability of closer relationships. There won't be political federation, but our economies are so interlinked and relatively small that there are clear benefits for us to treat the region as one. And again, I think we have been far out in front. Jamaica has always been perhaps the most liberal in terms of welcoming other persons from the Caribbean. If you go through Jamaica in terms of a whole list of doctors, a whole range of persons, particularly because of the fact that University of the West Indies once had only one campus, and it's in Jamaica. So we have been quite liberal, and we remain that liberal in terms of accepting professionals or other Caribbean persons to come and live and work in Jamaica. But recently, and I've been particularly involved in this because the Ministry of Finance, because of its intervention in the financial sector, has had several assets to sell. And the biggest buyers have been from the Eastern Caribbean, in particular Trinidad and Barbados. So in recent times, we have sold the controlling interest in the Carib Cement to Trinidad Cement. We have sold controlling interest in the second largest life insurance company, Mutual Life, which has been sold to Guardian Life, which paradoxically used to be a subsidiary of Mutual Life. There are several other things. We are almost close to completing negotiations to sell the third or fourth largest bank in Jamaica to a Trinidadian entity. So the integration is taking place. And it's important to understand that perhaps that is even more important than agreements signed by ministers of finance or prime ministers, because it's not just the agreement, but it is, as they say in America, where the tire hits the road, where the real thing occurs, and we have demonstrated that. There's the issue of moving towards a common currency, etc. That is dependent on several factors which have to be resolved. For example, whilst Barbados has a fixed exchange rate relative to the US dollar, we do not have a fixed exchange rate, and we do not intend to have a fixed exchange rate. We have a system, a market system, where you can either keep your foreign exchange or sell it, and you sell it only if you consider the price being what you wish to sell for. So that would have to be resolved in terms of harmonizing exchange rate policy. There are other issues which would have to be resolved, but whilst we're in agreement that this is the road we are going, I would suggest that perhaps more important is to look at the actual developments. In listing the sale of assets, Barbados Mutual has also bought controlling interest in one of the major Jamaican life insurance companies, and there are more sales which will be taking place. So we are firmly committed, and Jamaica's economy is, Jamaica's population is half of CARICOM, or half of English-speaking CARICOM. So if we are fully on board, essentially, recently I visited Trinidad, and I met with, I would think, every single major person in the manufacturing and commerce and the financial sector. And we're not just talking, we're talking about concrete investments. So we are fully on board in that regard.
One of the things that we have not, I think, dealt with adequately in the Caribbean is the question of intra-Caribbean trade.
Yes.
Certainly it has lagged behind trade between individual Caribbean countries and, let's say, North America, the United States of America.
Yes.
How have you been dealing with that? What mechanisms have you put in place to up into Caribbean trade?
Well, I need to, from the point of view of imports, Jamaica has a serious trade deficit with the rest of Caribbean. Trinidad and Barbados, Trinidad partly because of oil, but even with manufacturing goods. What I need to do is to encourage more Jamaican exporters to enter into the Caribbean market. There are always excuses. They complain that they sometimes have, although CARICOM eliminates restrictions, they complain that whilst the agreements say that, there are obstacles. But we need to encourage additional, as you say, intra-Caribbean trade. But I want to go broader than that. I want to pull in Cuba, and Dominican Republic, and Haiti. And we have initiated Jamaica's Export-Import Bank has initiated a line of credit with the Cuban Central Bank to stimulate trade with Cuba. It's a small line of credit, but I have given a commitment to increase the size if the need arises. So I think we need to both stimulate increased trade between the English-speaking Caribbean, but also take advantage of the export possibilities into the non-English-speaking Caribbean. And Cuba is one good possibility because it's a centrally planned economy. There are several sectors which are underdeveloped, which are aimed at consumer goods. But if they are going into tourism, then tourism, you have to satisfy what the tourists wish. So there are opportunities for you to supply consumer goods, particularly into their tourism sector, which is essentially an export sector. And as you know, Jamaica has two multinational tourism companies, the Sandals Group and the Super Clubs Group, and they are managing several hotels. They're running several hotels in Cuba. So there's an opportunity for us to see the Caribbean market, not just in terms of the English-speaking market, and it's something which perhaps even your program should start exploring, that the Caribbean is bigger than the English-speaking Caribbean. I should tell you that several of the Trinidadian investors into the Jamaican manufacturing sector have identified, one of the reasons they have moved into Jamaica is that they feel that this will give them a logical step-off point to enter into Cuba. Because Jamaica has long had trading relationship with Cuba. So we need to work hard at it because our tendency has been to look to North America. We also need to look at Europe much more because the possibilities are also there for stimulating increased trade with Europe.
In our last 90 seconds or so, Jamaica's position in the Caribbean Court of Justice. I know there's been some disagreements in Jamaica,
Right.
and I sense that this issue is becoming the victim of the political divide, the partisan divide in Jamaica.
It is partly politics, but there are also concerns which I wouldn't, by professionals, which I wouldn't, to which I wouldn't ascribe political motives.
Okay.
I believe that it's so important that we should give all voices a chance to be heard. But in the final analysis, I think that every rational Caribbean person will subscribe to the fact that sooner or later we need to have the highest court of appeal to be Caribbean based. But I wouldn't, although the opposition party has indicated its objection, there are persons who are not politically motivated, who have concerns, and I believe that their concerns should be responded to. And I think at any step which is this significant, we should give all, as I said, give the chance for all voices to be heard, and this we will do. We won't rush into such a significant move without hearing all possible objections. But in the final analysis, I think it's inevitable.
Minister Davies, I want to thank you so much for coming on
You're
to
welcome.
CaribNation, and I hope that we'll be able to get a lot out of our conversation today to stimulate our interest in what's happening in the Caribbean.
You're welcome, and I enjoy being on the program.
Well, there you have it, from the horse's mouth, as they say. The man who's in charge of finance and planning in Jamaica, Minister Omar Davies. Until the next time, this is David Hnds, thanking you for tuning in to yet another edition of CaribNation. And remember, as always, our motto here is one people, one culture, one Caribbean, one nation. And as we always say, rally round the West Indies.